The Dawnbringer Chronicles, Part 2. With a crinkled scowl, the little girl placed her hand on either side of her head and wriggled her stubby fingers. Like this, from the sides, she added, and then a big swoopy moon in the back, like this. She swept her arms over her shoulder in an arc. Tom finished his charcoal sketch and sat back. What was left was a monstrous heap of darkness, borne aloft by four legs and a long smudge of ink with spidery horns sat atop it. He grimaced through a smile as he placed a small phial of aqua gyrians, whatever, into her waiting palms. "I'm sure Mistress Barron will find this very helpful. You may go," he said, waving her away. The girl skittered out of the door and vanished into the overwhelming fog of the settlement. A slender figure in a long jade cape poked her head through the stairwell. "Did you get anything?" she asked, voice feral with curiosity. "This is nothing," shrugged Tom. "An elf on a deer, maybe. Or perhaps a portent of doom," she declared as she leaned over the shoulder of her tired assistant. "Don't you see it, Tom? I told him I'll prove it. It's all part of a cycle. The death of the animals, the heavy malices, the flies. They're all connected to each other." And with this declaration, she snatched the drawing from below Tom's nose and began frantically scribing notes across it. "And what will happen to the further field when the cycle finishes?" Tom asked. But Mistress Barron had already stopped listening. He heaved a deep sigh and picked up his bag. "I'm going home for the night. I'm leaving, okay?" After receiving a non-committal grunt and a hand wave, the young assistant quietly let himself out, into air that was far too heavy and a stronghold that was far too quiet. The bells began like an itch in Tom's ears, deep within his dreams. They swelled to a horrendous, disharmonic crescendo until he jolted awake so hard that his neck cracked in protest. He plunged his fingers into his ear canals and twisted them until they came away red. But still, the bells continued their never-ending peal. As he stumbled across the center of the stronghold, Tom noticed dozens of settlers leaning against the sides of houses or resting against the walls, their heads in their hands. Many more were curled up in doorways, unable to even stand as they clutched their temples in pain. He burst into his mistress' domicile in a fresh panic. Mistress Barron was sitting exactly where Tom had left her yesterday. She was reading her notes with a glazed expression, and the ink at the end of her pen had dribbled into a large bloat. "Mistress Barron," he called over the thundering of the bells. "Are you all right?" Tom. Sorry, time must have gotten away from me." Whilst her voice had calmed since yesterday, sweat beaded across her pale brow. "Where were we?" "The bells. The fifth portent," he prompted. "What do we do about the bells?" "Just let me take a break," she reassured him. "We can deal with it later. We'll deal with it later." Tom peeled his master's herb bag from her limp shoulder. He tore two small stripes from the bottom of his tunic and stuffed them into his ears. "Join me when you're ready," he said, giving her shoulder a reassuring pat. It dampened his skin with sweat. "I'll go on ahead." Across the road from Master Barron's hut, the girl from yesterday was standing next to her mother. The woman was half lying, half sitting against the wall of her domicile as her daughter tried desperately to push the contents of the aqua gyrians phial past her lips. Tom crouched down next to the pair, fighting the urge to crawl up himself and scratch at his stuffed-up ears until they bled. He gave the girl a shallow smile. "Help me get her to bed, eh? There's a good girl." They hooked the mother's arms around each of their shoulders. She was even colder and sweatier than Master Barron had been, and her rotting breath caused bile to rise in Tom's throat. He swallowed it down and began to lift. The woman was stuck fast. Was this part of a previous portent? Was this another? Tom wasn't sure anymore. He looked down to the woman's legs. Dark pools of blood had formed all over her dress, where the skin of her body had begun to melt away and fuse into the floor. He could see the daughter's lips part as she screamed, but the fabric in his ears and the distant ringing of the bells rendered him all but deaf. The girl dropped her mother's lifeless arm and fled into the darkness of the domicile, slamming the door behind her. Tom made his way across the center of the settlement. He had to reach the aqueduct. Perhaps he could somehow cleanse the woman's legs of corruption and hope her to stand. His breath had become labored. The strain of trying to help her up had drained a lot of his strength. He slowed from a run to a walk before finally stopping a few meters away from the great stone structure. He'd sit just for a few moments and then make the rest of the journey. By the time Tom came around, the sun was setting, or perhaps rising, in a sickly green sky. A small part of him thought he would stand, but his body just felt so heavy. He had been on his way to get something for someone. He wasn't quite sure how long that had been. The fell half-light that had settled over the stronghold picked out strange shapes loping past the walls. Their shallow skin was covered with a sheen of pus. In their center he saw a dark blot upon the warping, weeping landscape. A horse so decayed that its bare skull hung out of its shredded neck, ridden by a single robed figure. From the rider's head sprouted a pair of gore-slicked antlers. As his servants laughed and danced around the corpse of fly-pocketed settlers, the figure dismounted with a wet thump and shuffled forwards. He rested his great scythe against his shoulders as he knelt by Tom's body. "You have done well to survive thus far, O woeful youth." Tom winced as the baleful words echoed directly into his mind. "Thy will halt rendered thee a worthy sacrifice." Tom dimly felt the tip of the rider's scythe draw gently across his stomach. A bloom of pain cut through his stupor, but he no longer had the energy to scream. His beery eyes followed his own intestines as the rider gathered them up and spread them out. The merry creature around him laughed and offered soft smatters of applause. "Sir Geryon approached it with his men from the west," whispered a man's voice, though all of his servants seemed to hear and heed his words. "We shall meet them at daybreak. As his servants scattered to prepare their ambush, the figure turned to Tom and smiled. Flies nestled in the holes of his crusted helmet. "Thou hast earned a quick death," he said, drawing to his full height and brandishing his scythe. Then he stepped away. "'Tis truly too bad that the great-grandfather wishes nothing more than thy slow decay." As the authors of Furifield's premonitions scattered and vanished, Tom lay with his back against the stones. His eyes were too dry to shed tears. All he could hear now was the bell's final knell, hollow and keening, welcoming him home.